Part 5. America, Divining for Oil. After my mother's death in the Channel Islands, I found myself free of all family ties and responsibilities. So, when I had paid the death duties and satisfied the rapacity of the government, I sold the house in Guernsey and decided to travel. Until now my travels had been mainly confined to Europe. Now, I began to hanker after something on a larger scale and turned my thoughts to America and the Canadian Rockies. While quite a young man, my mother's youngest brother had married a beautiful American girl, who was then a widow, living in Sacramento, California. I thought that I might begin my travels by paying her a visit. She had had 2 children, but the son had been killed in a mining accident just before I arrived, and the daughter was living in the old home, which was an orchard property in the Californian hills. The mother and daughter, Dolly, were in Sacramento to meet me. Dolly was an enterprising girl. At the age of 16 she had run away with one of the men employed in the orchard and married him, to her mother's annoyance and her father's sorrow. When I arrived, she had 3 big sons, all over 6 feet and extremely good-looking. I never discovered whether she still had a husband or what had happened to him. There was no sign of him about the house, but there was no lack of other men. She was still very attractive. They were jolly and amusing people to stay with, and I had the satisfaction of taming a very savage watchdog, which Dolly had just bought. It must have been very badly treated by its former owners. It took to me at once and became my shadow, and I have often wondered how it fared after I left. My still good-looking aunt had a big, handsome brother who had been a minister of state in California for 28 years and was a candidate for re-election. He invited me to accompany him on a tour of his constituency in his enormous car. We had 2 other men with us and a dashing young lady secretary, who was supposed to be there as a chaperone for me. She certainly needed one herself a great deal more than I did. We ran down the coast to Santa Barbara and the oil fields of Signal Hill, and it was there that I got my first experience of divining for oil. My host stopped at the headquarters of the various oil fields and had a chat with the managers, and I soon discovered how popular he was wherever he went. Although he pretended to laugh at divination, he knew that I was very anxious to try my hand at it. I naturally felt that it might be the chance of a lifetime to discover whether oil could be found by divining and whether, in fact, I could do so myself. At one of the big oil fields, he asked the manager if I might be allowed to try, and, to please him, a young deputy manager was instructed to take me over the oil field and show me everything that I wanted to see and to satisfy my every wish. On the way I explained to him that, so far as I knew, divining for oil had never been attempted before, so I had no idea whether it would work. He entered into the spirit of the tests and was most cooperative. First of all he took me to a group of producing wells and suggested that I should walk round them and see whether I got any reaction. I found that the reaction was far more powerful than any I had obtained from water, or even from tin and copper. He then proposed that I should try 4 wells and see whether I could tell him which was producing the most oil. That was far more difficult, as I had to depend solely on the violence of the reaction on myself. I finally picked out the best one, but was unable to put the other 3 in their proper order. However, as it was my first attempt, I was not unduly discouraged. The next test was a dry well, the derrick of which had not been dismantled. I was given to understand that it was a yielding well, like the others. Instead of getting a violent reaction as I expected, I got nothing. I tried from every angle, with the same result. I was very worried, as I felt that I might not be able to find oil after all, if my reactions could not be depended upon. But the deputy manager finally put me out of my misery by telling me that it was a dry well, which he had given to me as a test. This convinced us both that I could find oil and could tell whether it was there or not. I was, however, surprised to find that there could be a dry well among so many that were yielding, the reason being that there are many cracks or faults in the Earth's crust and, if a bore goes into one, the result is a dry hole. My guide then motored me to a place some distance from my first testing ground. "I wonder what you will make of this," he said. "Wander around and see whether you can find anything and, if so, what." At first I could find nothing as I was too far south, but when I turned round and went north I was suddenly nearly thrown off my feet. My rod worked in violent jerks, sometimes up and sometimes down. I jumped about and turned and twisted like someone demented. The young manager was holding his sides with laughing, but it was no joke so far as I was concerned, for it then seemed impossible to get away from whatever was affecting me. When I did get out of its influence and my convulsive movements ceased, I was told that it was gas, not oil, that had caused my antics. This exhausting performance, coming at the end of a test which had lasted several hours, made me feel very ill. I was attacked with violent nausea and a blinding headache. I half lay and half sat on the floor of the car in a miserable heap. The heat was intense, and never in all my life have I longed so much for a darkened room and a quiet bed. Next day, we had to move on. I had still to learn that oil divining has a very severe and exhausting effect on the diviner. Often, when I have been testing an area for oil, especially when it has been there in payable quantities, I would do a most dramatic stage fall and everything would black out. As I was generally out with men, they got scared and, next time, would take out a flask of brandy, just in case. I would be all right so long as no one touched me until I came round, but when, in mistaken kindness, they tried to force brandy down my throat, the results were disastrous. Also, I hated brandy and it seemed such a waste. Divining for water can be very tiring, but one can get a lot of fun out of it. But divining for oil is no joke, the work is much too hard. It is perhaps just as well that very few people have the gift. Although few diviners will admit it, the gift of divining for water and the gift of divining for oil are two entirely different things. The only way to find out whether a diviner has both gifts is to test him, as I was tested. He must be ready to learn how to find oil, for his experience with water will be of little use to him. By admitting this, he will spare himself much disappointment and save divination many a bad mark. I sometimes wonder whether the ill effects on diviners when seeking oil is nature taking her revenge for their interference in her work which she carries on secretly in the earth. If it is true that oil is still in a state of metamorphism, it seems possible that if it were left undisturbed in the earth it might eventually become drastically changed and possess powers about which, at present, we can only surmise. Even now, no one wants oil for the actual oil itself but simply for the power it already contains and which man has learnt to release for his own use and misuse. In spite of my work as a diviner which includes the finding of more oil, I cannot but admit that perhaps the world would be happier and its future less gloomy if oil, and the extraordinary power it contains, had never been discovered. End of Part 5.